Good morning, everyone, and welcome also to those online. Nice to be back together with this series after the summer break. This is just going to be a short series because it's quite interrupted over the next. We've really only got a couple of weeks till we enter into back into a break period as we have the Rosh HaShana, Kippur, and Sukkot. And I decided to focus on Moshe Cordovero, who is our next Jewish thinker, life and times and thoughts, partly because there is a Mussar element to his work. Mussar is the system of self-development and spiritual growth. And one of his works in particular, the Tome of Devorah, the so-called palm tree of Devorah, really has become quite a classic of the Mussar movement. So much later in history than this particular figure, there arose in East Europe the personality of Yisroel Salanter, who promoted a sort of relook at ethical development and the concept of Mussar. And he very much encouraged the learning of one of the particular works of this person we're going to talk about over the month of Ellul, and therefore I sort of felt this was an appropriate figure to look at in the month of Ellul. Warning for those both live and online. Next week, we will be looking at some of his Mussar thoughts. So anyone who wants to avoid Mussar and wants to stick very strictly to philosophy, it's not the week to come. But I do feel, on a serious note, since it's Chodesh Ellul in preparation for the Yammim Noraim, I want to do something which had both a philosophical and a Mussar sort of element to it. Now, Moshe Cordovero, I'm going to argue, is the most significant Jewish thinker of hundreds of years that we've barely heard of, or perhaps haven't heard of at all. He's a truly remarkable figure, a sort of rare genius of staggering proportion, and relatively unknown. Most people haven't heard of him or have barely heard of him, due to his remarkable success in some ways, and also within a moment of his death, him being superseded by another figure, the great Ariza of Tsefat. And as a result, his sort of reign was short, but the Ariza and what we think of as Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, post Ariza Kabbalah, is beyond indebted to him. It's just simply inconceivable to think of the whole flourishing of Kabbalah over the last 500 years without the figure of Moshe Cordovero. And when we think about the impact of Kabbalah on the Jewish world today, it's just staggering. I mean, we look at so many tefillos that have been woven into our text as a result of Kabbalah, the sort of Brit Shemay and many others on a B'koyach. Not that he composed them, but their introduction into mainstream Jewish life. Obviously, the movement of Hasidus, which is so heavily sort of built on Kabbalistic ideas, but the Misnagdic world, the non-Hasidish world, thoughts of the Vilna Gaon and the Nefesh Chaim, Reb Chaim Volozhin, is built so significantly on Kabbalah. In Halacha, the impact of Kabbalah on the Psukim of the Magen Avraham, who consistently quotes from the Ksovim, from the writings of the Ariza. So Kabbalah is just so much, so influential in what we think of as Judaism today. And it's not an exaggeration to say that's the foundation of all of that is absolutely on the incredible work of this Moshe Cordovero. So we're looking at a remarkable and seminal figure, and someone who's is in a sense a grandfather of Kabbalah. If modern day Kabbalah is the system of the Ariza, then the grandfather, he's the father of what we think of as the Kabbalistic system nowadays. And then the grandfather of that system is this Moshe Cordovero. So let's just start off with facts. And we actually don't know a huge amount about him, but let's just start off with the bits that we do. He's born in 1522, died in 1570, so he dies at 48, so a relatively short life. In order to understand his life just from a historical perspective, we need 2 points of introduction. The first is, as with so much in the 1522 when he's born, 1520s and on, we need to really start with the terrible events of 1492 and 1497. 1492 is the expulsion of Jews from Spain. 1497, the expulsion of Jews from Portugal. The Iberian Peninsula is now Judenrein, free of Jews. And I spoke actually recently in a drasha about the sort of the double tragedy, because many Spanish Jews went via Portugal and then were expelled for a second time. A terrible, traumatic event in Jewish history. Ramosha Cordovero comes from a family of one of these Iberian refugees. Where do the Iberian refugees run away to? Some of them run northwards to Germany and set up Spanish and Portuguese communities there, and Holland, and eventually make their way here to the UK. Some of them drift into East Europe and effectively become assimilated into the Ashkenazi world, where their origin is perhaps only indicated by their surname. Scolina Rebbe's family is family Portugal. There's a Brisker family known as Don Yichya. There's other names that don't give it away so much, but Epstein's are largely descendants of refugees from the Iberian Peninsula, but originally Ben-Ministi family, and various families that sort of the Emmanuel family that became integrated, effectively became Ashkenazi for all intents and purposes. But the vast majority of the refugees run away to North Africa, where they have a significant influence on the Sephardi communities there in Morocco, and then spread into so-called Sephardi communities spread towards the Middle East. And many of them go to the Ottoman Empire. They're received with open arms by the Ottomans. Turkish would think of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, that sort of location, who are very keen to get the Jews who are talented and business connections and creative and educated, and they welcome them into the Ottoman Empire. And that's the backgrounds of Ramosha Cordovero's family. Exactly where he came from, we don't know, but we think, based on his surname, that he was originally of Spanish origin, who came via Portugal. The reason we think he's originally of Spanish origin is because he's clearly named after the location Cordovero. People are only named after the location once they've left there. It's not a good surname to call someone after the locality where they're found. So if you use the surname of the locality where someone is found, then all of our surname would be London. That wouldn't be a particularly good way to identify people. If you go somewhere else, if you end up in Greenland, then you can imagine you're known as the Londoner, and then that could become your surname. So if you see someone whose surname is Ashkenazi, almost invariably, whilst they may have lived for a time in Ashkenaz, or perhaps have a great-great-grandfather who was from Ashkenaz, almost invariably the family now comes from somewhere in the Spanish, in the Sephardi realm, and so on. So his family origins are probably Cordova, but he certainly left Cordova, and that's when the surname was adopted. Why do we think he came via Portugal? Because of a semantic detail, which is the way he spelt his surname was the way it was generally spelt in Portuguese pronunciation, as opposed to in Portuguese it became almost Cordevero rather than Cordevero. And even though we refer to him as Cordevero, the spelling of his name was Cordevero, and therefore probably he came via Portugal. But that's pretty much all we know about the background, which is probably Spain, Portugal, Ottoman Empire, and then Tsefat, which is where he spent his life, and that's where he flourished. He's born 30 years after the expulsion, 1522, and the expulsion is 1492, 1497, so either 30 years or 25 years after his family are forced to leave. And he flourishes in Tsefat, maybe born in Tsefat, maybe his family had already arrived before he was born, and maybe not born in Tsefat, maybe born somewhere else in the Ottoman Empire, but like so many other Jews, migrated to Tsefat. Just briefly, so we've got the broad outline of his life, and then we'll look at this in more detail. Till 20, he has a classic Jewish education in Nigla, in Gemara and Halacha, and the like. At 20, in a mystical experience, he hears a voice which challenges him to start learning Kabbalah, and for the rest of his life, in other words, the remaining 28 years, he learns Kabbalah. And 4 years into his Kabbalistic pursuit, at 26, he begins writing and produces a phenomenal output in the 22 years of his writing, a staggering output. And I'll try and share with you a little later what that output is, but that's basically the structure of his life. The name of his wife, who he gets married to, we don't know, but we know that she's a sister of R Shlomo Alkabetz. So his brother-in-law is R Shlomo Alkabetz. Shlomo Alkabetz, famous for and also significant Kabbalist in his own right. And we know that he has at least one son called Gedalia, who's very young when he dies, perhaps 8 years old. So perhaps Gedalia is born when his father is 40. And Gedalia is, nowadays we'd call him the literary executor of his father's estate. He's the one who inherits the manuscripts and arranges for their publication. Eventually gets them published in Italy under the influence of a very, very significant Kabbalist from sort of a generation later, the Ramah Mipano. and who probably pays actually Gedalia, the orphan, and the widow for these manuscripts, and they spread significantly. Everyone is crazy over the Ramak, Ramosha Cordovero. The descriptions of him are outstanding. The people that knew him were just beyond effusive about what a remarkable individual he was. His modesty, his midas, his genius, his learning. It's rare, and great figures often get described in effusive terms, particularly by students and later generations. Here we're talking about contemporaries who just, they're crazy over him. And they can't describe enough. I mean, the Ariza, who knew him briefly, says about him, this is a man who died without sin. But they overlap. We're talking about a contemporary describing someone in those terms. The Arizal asked to be buried next to him, and indeed, you can go to Tsefat to this day and see the two Kvarim next to each other. So he's a genuinely incredible figure. We know little about his life's experiences, but he, as I said, he lives in Tsefat, and in a moment we'll talk about Tsefat. He has a couple of autobiographical details that he writes about himself. And it seems he had a fairly difficult life. He was probably poor. He speaks about Se'irim, youngsters who attacked him. We don't really know what that event was, but he was troubled by kids in the area, youth in the area. I don't know why. He also had a spiritually challenging life, meaning to say that his Kabbalistic experiences are heavy and tough for him. We'll speak later about what it means to be Makubal and the little bit we understand of sort of Kabbalistic experiences, but he experiences it as heavy. He's battling his way through the mystical world and the mystical experiences. It's not light for him. It's tough and it's hard. So that's the sort of basic outline of what we know about him. Let's just step back and talk for a few minutes about Tsefat, which is where he flourishes. And then we'll try and sort of unpick in more detail the sort of very brief sketch that I've given about him. So Tsefat is an amazing place. It starts off as a backwater. Incidentally, Tsefat not really mentioned in Tanakh. It doesn't have any significant Jewish history that we are aware of till the sort of late 1400s, early 1500s. And even though we now talk of it as sort of one of the holy cities, it became sanctified through basically 60, 70 years of its history. That's it. And for a short time, it became the capital, almost in a sense, of the Jewish world. A remarkable sort of collection of incredible people and output from that little place for a few decades. And then it carries ticking along, but it sort of goes into relative decline. It's not obvious, by the way, that Eretz Yisrael, Tzfat, Eretz Yisrael should have been a Torah center. The population of Jews in Israel is very small. Torah centers normally flourish when you have good economic circumstances and a large population. Just statistically, there's only a certain number of outstanding individuals, extraordinarily talented individuals per the population. And therefore, a large population is just going to produce more individuals if it has the right settings. You need good economic circumstances because you need a good educational infrastructure. You can only have a flourishing of Jewish learning and civilization when people are prosperous enough to fund academics, to fund people to learn, when you fund yeshivas and kollel and so on. So you need sort of certain conditions. And Eretz Yisrael is a little bit of a backwater, sadly, at the time. It basically remains a backwater, as we know, all the way through till mass immigration in the late 1800s. It always has, starting from this time on, it has a Jewish population, always has some Jewish population. But from this time on, it has a decent population. And it produces the sporadic godel here and there. It has great figures and great thinkers, but the leading Torah center, not really to be expected. Spain, before the expulsion, is obviously a leading Torah center. It's the largest and richest Jewish community in the world. Germany, very significant. Ashkenaz, northern France. Then the population shifts to East Europe, and of course, East Europe becomes the dominant Torah center for several hundred years. But for a very short amount of time, Tzfat has a reign of glory. You know, it sort of rises supreme in the Jewish world. And there's two reasons for that, really, which are overlapping. The first reason is economic. The Ottoman Empire creates a free zone, a free trading zone in the area, and therefore North Israel goes through a bit of a boom, and that's probably why the Spanish refugees are attracted there. They're probably given incentives, sort of startups to set up business and so on. the sultans of the Ottoman Empire are pursuing a economic policy. They want the area to boom, and most of them end up in the shmata business, right? In fabrics and weaving and thread production and garment production and so on. Sorry, I should say Tsefat is not producing it; it's trading it. It's their dealers in this, and that's the reason why the area flourishes. So that's factor number one. It goes through an economic boom, which continues for several decades, and then it declines. Perhaps the Ottoman Empire changes the economic circumstances. Perhaps there's earthquakes there, certainly, and that has a negative impact, and various other reasons. The second reason it has this incredible flourishing is because of the influx of Spanish refugees. Even though it's too small to really sustain a long-term flourishing Torah center, it gets packed with descendants of Spanish refugees, and they produce this outstanding combination of figures. I mean, it's a real who's who, that generation of leaders, and almost all of them are connected to the Ramak. His Rebbe, his main teacher in Nigla, in Halacha, is no less a figure than Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef, who teaches him Torah, and Rabbi Yosef Karo is there. The Ramak is there, R Shlomo Alkabetz is there, who we already mentioned. The Ariza ends up there, who we mentioned. A figure called Rabbi Rama Azulai actually comes to Tsefat to learn under the Ramak, no less. The Rabbi Rama Azulai is the grandfather of the Chidah, very famous figure. There's a figure called Rabbi Vidal, the Reishis Chochma, who's a senior Kabbalist who's there. There's Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, less heard of, but very, very important halachist. So there's just this glittering array of remarkable figures, many of whom produce works that remain beyond significance to this day. The Alshich writes his parish, the Alshich al Torah. Beis Yosef, of course, produces the most important halachic work of the millennia, the Shulchan Aruch. But he also produces other work for which he's known as Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef, which is a super commentary on the Torah. He produces the Kesef Mishnah, which is the classic commentary on the Rambam. Again, remarkable that one person wrote so much. The Beis Yosef is also a Kabbalist. He's primarily a halachist, but he deals in Kabbalah and has his own mystical experiences. I think I may have mentioned them once. He has a remarkable work, a diary of his mystical experiences called the Magid Mesharim, where he speaks about the Magid, an angelic figure that appears to him and teaches him Torah. One of the interesting features, by the way, of Jewish mysticism, generally speaking, and particularly the Tsefat era of mysticism, is the same figures who are mystics are also all senior halachists. So the Ariza or the Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, are known primarily as Kabbalists, but they are significant halachists. The Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, is known primarily as a halachist, but he's a significant Kabbalist. So we often think of mystics as people who detach themselves from society and meditate in caves and in the wilderness. We often think about them as, you always wonder a bit about a mystic. Are they completely rational? Are they reasonable people? Maybe their mysticism is the product of a sort of fantastic mind, delusions and hallucinations and things like that. But these figures, all of them are remarkable scholars, and we know that because we have their works. So Rabbi Yosef Karo has to be he's perhaps one of the finest legal minds ever. He's able to take really 1,500 years of scholarship and produce this encyclopedic work, the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch is only a shadow of his real work, which is the Beis Yosef, the commentary on the Torah. The Shulchan Aruch is his conclusion, so it's just a beautiful legal document. But behind it is the research, and we have the research because we've got the Beis Yosef, in which and anyone who ever learns a sugya, a topic in Gemara in depth, and then you open the Beis Yosef and you see how he sort of draws out the threads from all the sugyas and collates them and all the commentaries and produces coherent halachic reasoning. It's just mind-blowing. So the same figure who's this outstanding halachist is a Kabbalist. And actually, throughout Jewish history, most of the well-known Kabbalists, though not all, are also significant halachists. The Vilna Gaon and his Beis HaMedrash. If you go back to the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the sort of Kabbalistic world in the 1100s, 1200s, most of them are also Balei Tosfos. They're producing the sort of astounding scholastic analysis that was popular at the time of the Balei Tosfos at the same time as being Kabbalists. So it's a remarkable world, and the Ramak is part of that scene. He's a student of the Beis Yosef. He then becomes a colleague of the Beis Yosef. Rabbi Yosef appoints him to, Rabbi Yosef Karo appoints him to his beis din. For time, maybe he has his own independent beis din. The Beis Yosef has a collection of teshuvot, so not his main published works, but responsim that he wrote. And there's occasions where he writes the Ramak twice, to the best of my knowledge, where he writes to the Ramak asking a shaila of the Ramak. He's the senior Talmudist, no doubt. Rabbi Yosef Karo is the senior figure. But he turns to his junior colleague and says, "Can you research this? Can you come up with a conclusion?" Rabbi Yosef Karo writes about the Ramak that his depth of halachic analysis is astounding. He's a phenomenal dayan, by the way. So again, he's a mystic and a Kabbalist. But he's a dayan. Dayanim are dealing with earthy stuff, and he somehow balances both of these together in an amazing way. So he's an outstanding halachist, though that's not his claim to fame, and he's an outstanding Kabbalist, and this is his claim to fame. So what does it mean to be an outstanding Kabbalist, and what is he known for? Why is he such a seminal and important figure, and what's his influence? So let's just talk about the works he wrote and what he achieved. So at age 20, he becomes a student of his brother-in-law. I'm not aware, maybe we don't know, but I'm certainly can't remember at this moment whether he's already a brother-in-law or later becomes a brother-in-law. Becomes a student of R Shlomo Alkabetz, who's a significant Kabbalist. Within a few years, R Shlomo Alkabetz is declaring publicly he's a Talmud of his brother-in-law. So the teacher has become the student. And again, I want to emphasize, you don't really find anywhere with Moshe Cordovero jealousy or anything like that. The people around him, he was so clearly above and beyond everyone else that the people around him just speak about him in awe and are so open about their relationship to him. So Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of Cordevero, who's a significant Kabbalist, becomes his student. And then the Ramak embarks on 22 years of writing, in which he produces outstanding work after outstanding work in an amazing way. We have witness testimony of him writing, how he wrote, and he seems to have entered into almost a trance-like state in which his pen is just, it's not auto-writing. They talk about auto-writing and something like that. But he's writing at just an amazing free flow of consciousness. But it's not a free flow of consciousness which is all over the place. It's very, very systematic and very organized and very structured. But he's able to do this at a remarkable speed. I'm going out of order in the works that he wrote, but the work that... Yeah. So if we didn't have the Ramak, what I want to bring out is that if we didn't have the Ramak, we wouldn't have really the next part. It's difficult. I mean, maybe someone else would have eventually come and done it, but it's difficult to conceive of the next 500 years of Kabbalistic writing. He lays the foundation of everything that follows. What do you mean out? Oh, because they're Kabbalists. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. One of the things I'm leaving in all these series is I'm not really talking about what to make of all of this. Everyone has their. We could do maybe a dedicated share to how do we understand these sorts of things. But I'll simply say that I've put effort into reading the writings of any mystics I can get hold of in sorts of different areas. However you understand it, whether you understand it as an external event or an internal event of the mind, there are altered states of consciousness. There are experiences people have in which they enter into a different... Altered states of consciousness sounds very mystical, but we all know what it is. You experience an altered state of consciousness every time you have your Shabbos afternoon shluf, right? Consciousness is not a one event. There's lots of layers of consciousness. When you're in shul, when you're talking to someone, you've got a state of consciousness, you're aware of a person. When you're in shul and you're spacing out and you're listening to the Megillah, but you're tired because it's after Tanis Esther, and you're hearing every word, but your mind's going all over the place also, or you're sort of awake. That is a type of state of consciousness. When you're davening and you suddenly feel the thump of your chest and you look down to see who's hit you and you realize it's your hands because it's Slachmanu, that's a state of consciousness. We humans go through different states. And when you're asleep, you're in a state of consciousness. You are somewhat conscious when you're asleep. If someone calls your name, you might wake up. If there's a smell of fire, God forbid, you might wake up. These are states of consciousness. The hypnosis is a well-known state of consciousness. It's a real phenomena. When a child doesn't want to eat, and you say to the child, There's the and it goes into the mouth of the child. Why is the child eating? Because children have very easily suspended state of consciousness, and you've done almost like a low level of hypnosis in which they're sort of conscious of what you're doing. There is such a phenomena, and there's no doubt that these figures are entering into altered states of consciousness in which they're having spiritual experiences. What to make of those spiritual experiences? To what degree are these external experiences of an objective reality? To what degree are these internal experiences of a subjective reality? That all depends on how you view these things. So sorry, all of this is a long way of answering your question, which is there's no doubt that this production is somewhat linked to altered states of consciousness. Their phenomenal output is definitely linked to that. Whether that has to be a Kabbalist or it could be other forms of altered states of consciousness, you'll form your own judgments. But yes, it's definitely linked to that. But by the way, rationalists also enter into altered states of consciousness. The Rambam, I don't really like this terminology, mystic and rationalist, because these figures are mystics, but they're supreme rationalists. You can't write the Shulchan Aruch or the Beis Yosef unless you're a rationalist. And as I hope you'll see, you can't write Moshe Cordovero's work unless you're a rationalist. We'll see what he achieved in a few moments. The Rambam, who's a philosopher, definitely sort of meditated and entered into meditative experiences in his writings and in doing this, and had what in some respects you could call mystical experiences. Let me just try and explain what I mean. When you read the autobiographies of some mathematicians, many of them do not experience maths as a sort of algorithmic calculating machine experience, especially those that delve into sort of deeper areas of maths like number theory and so on. They experience almost as if they're wandering through the landscape of numbers and encountering things. And they almost feel like they're explorers discovering things rather than working them out. Many actually very creative people in the arts, in the sciences, describe epiphany-like experiences in which they almost use the words of as if an idea, struck me from above, almost from the heavens. I had a revelation. So we have a very narrow. One of the reasons why I'm giving this series and why I speak a lot about philosophy and Kabbalah on is because I feel we have like a very narrow perspective on these things, and however you deal with these things, we don't think enough about what it means to be a human, what it means to have conscious experience, and definitely their ability to write is because these are figures that are mystics that enter into altered states of consciousness. Yes, Neil.
You talk about
yes,
modern.
Yes.
But you talk about Kabbalistic influence 100 years.
Yes.
What their
Okay, so this is exactly what I'm going to come on to. I'm going to go out of order in the works that the Ramak wrote. I hope to cover and summarize all his works, but I'm going to go out of order. The work that at that generation was his claim to fame was a work called the Pardos Rimonim. Pardos Rimonim means the orchard of pomegranates. We don't know why he chose that name. He's a mystic. Pardos and Rimonim both are approximately in Gematria, meaning they're allowed one out, the same as Moshe, so it's possible that's the reason why he chose the name. I don't think he wrote that anywhere, but people have noticed that. In Kabbalah, there's a concept of a gematria which is exact in the concept of gematria, where it's im hakogel, where you count the words as a number in itself, and using that system, both Pardos and Rimonim end up as Moshe, as the same as his name Moshe. But either way, he wrote this work Pardos Rimonim, and basically it's two things. It's an encyclopedia of everything Kabbalistic till his day. And I want to tell you what everything Kabbalistic means in a moment. So it's an incredible work of collating hundreds of different sorts of sources, number one. And number two, he systemizes it. He creates a system and a structure to it so that it makes sense. So all these disparate sources, when this Kabbalist wrote this work on this topic, that's because he's dealing with this area of godliness or revelation. And when another Kabbalist wrote that over there, that's because he's dealing with this concept or this world, Kabbalistic world, or this stage in the unveiling of spirituality in the world. So he creates a structure to it. And this is what everyone goes crazy about. This is an intellectual feat of remarkable achievement. Okay, so now Neil's question. What Kabbalah has existed till Moshe Cordovero and the Ariza up to now? And the answer is a lot. Mysticism has always been around in the Jewish world. There's mystical, in some ways you could say, prophecy is a mystical experience. We know little about what it means to become a prophet, but we have little glimpses of prophetic training. Nach mentions schools of prophets. there's some, we have little descriptions of the encounter as prophets begin becoming prophets. We have the story, for example, of Shmuel, where he hears a voice and he doesn't even realize it's prophecy initially. We have almost all prophetic descriptions in the Torah starting with confusion, where they're not quite sure what's happening, and then clarity is arrived at. We have mystical stories around Moshe. Moshe's in the cleft of the rock, and he asks Hashem, "Show me your face." And Hashem says, "I can't show you your face. You can see the back of my face, but not." So even see with Moshe Rabbeinu, sort of mystical experiences there's tantalizing clues of mystical experiences already in stuff. I mean, the essence of a revelation and of a religion which is built around revelation has mysticism there, whether you like it or not. We then enter into the era of the Gemara, and the Gemara tells us mystical stories. For entering into the paradise, the orchard. So the word orchard, by the way, I mentioned Partus Romanium, the orchard of the pomegranates. Orchard is one of the things that are used as a description of mystical experiences. We have Rabbi Kiva and his colleagues talking about the mystical experiences, the danger of mystical encounter. There's the famous heretic Acher, who through his mystical experiences is Kotzitz Benetias. He cuts things off of their shoots. He somehow ruptures the growth. If you think of the analogy of spirituality as having roots and growing as plants, he's Kotzitz Benetias. He chops the plants down. We have Rabbi Kiva, who successfully enters the paradise and comes out alive. So we have a mystical tradition there, but we don't know that much about it. Then you have the Heicholot literature. The Heichol means a palace literature, which dates back to the era of the flourishing of Medrash. So these are sort of being written the year 600, 700, 800, 900. That's when they're sort of arising. They're called the palace literature because they describe Heicholos, sort of the encounter. If Hashem is a king and there's a palace around him, the label of Heicholos is used to describe the sort of spiritual realms and the exploration of these spiritual realms. Then you have in 1100, you have Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pious ones of Germany, not connected to what we call the Hasidic movement. Again, I mentioned them already, senior figures like the Rekeach, the Kloinemus family, Rabbi Lezer Worms, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. Rekeach, by the way, is the one who introduced saying Adovet Hashem Uri V'Yishi into Ashkenazi world, so we're keeping the practice that he introduced. These are also Balei Tosfos. They're writing Tosafist commentary. So these are, again, many of them, not all of them, many of them are senior Tosafists. And they have mystical writings. We've all met some of their mystical writings because we sing every Shabbos Anim Zemiros. I suggest, if you haven't done so up to now, look at Anim Zemiros, look at the translation, and it's a profoundly euphoric, beautiful, mystical work. It uses mystical imagery of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The same, by the way, Hasid Ashkenaz wrote many other Shirei Yichud, songs of harmony. If you look in the Yom Kippur Machzor, many communities had the minhag. Maybe we can reintroduce it in there and see if it's popular, to sing all through the Shirei Yichud on Yom Kippur night. It takes about 45 minutes and very difficult to understand. Mystical, they're Anim Zemiros type works written by various of Hasidei Ashkenaz. Very, very interesting and mystical experiences. By the way, I should mention that there's a myth out there that Ashkenazim didn't have access to and didn't know philosophy, and this was a sort of unique Spanish Jewish experience. And there's some truth to that. It was less known in the Ashkenazi world, but the Hasid Ashkenaz are very familiar with Platonic writings and Neoplatonic writings, and some of their works have a philosophical element to them. Also, you can trace the sort of language used. For those of you who remember when we were looking at the Jewish encounter with Neoplatonism, I coined it Aristotelian Neoplatonism. That's what the Aristotle that the Sephardim met was this figure that made its way to the Jewish world in Ashkenaz, and they also were studying this stuff, and you can recognize some of the words I used of Chom and Surah, and I mentioned some of the philosophical terminology that was made up. You can recognize that in the Shirei Yichud. By the way, they're called Shirei Yichud because they're all about Yichud, about one of the big Kabbalistic pursuits. In a way, if you had to summarize Kabbalah literally on one leg, you would say it's a mystic's attempt. One translation of the word translation of the word being a mystic is it's the longing and the desire and the belief that one can achieve union with the divine. That's one way of defining what it means to be a mystic. You believe that this physical world of ours and the spiritual world are not disconnected. You can unite them. As a monotheistic faith, Also, mysticism means that we want to unite the whole multiplicity that you see in this world. We live in a world of multiplicity, and yet it all gets back to one. And the job of the Kabbalist is to somehow understand how we have this crazy multiple world of ours when everything is one and divine. So Shira Yichud has a resonance to it. It's Yichud, it's unification. Again, we still have traces of this. In the non-Hasidic world, we don't say L'Shem Yichud much. For various historical reasons, many of us say L'Shem Yichud when it comes to Sfiras Omer. What are you saying? L'Shem Yichud. I'm not just seeing a mitzvah as something that I'm doing as a commandment of God, but I'm also seeing it as an act of unification. I'm unifying the world because I'm taking physicality and bringing it back to God. Not only am I unifying this world to God, but maybe I'm somehow even unifying God in a certain sense. God is one. But we're not aware of godliness as one. We experience godliness in contradictory ways. Sometimes we have good experiences and bad experiences. Sometimes we're aware of the presence of Hashem. Sometimes we're less aware of the presence of Hashem. There's God, the Holy One, and there's the Shekhinah, the awareness of holiness, and we're trying to unite the two. We have it, by the way, in another mystical prayer that we say, and we quote a pasuk at the end of it, on that day when Moshe comes and the world arrives at perfection, then Hashem will be one and his name will be one. What? Hashem's not one and his name's not one? Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad. Oh, what heresy? And I says, of course Hashem is one, but the world doesn't demonstrate that, doesn't experience that, and we aspire to unifying it. So what Kabbalistic literature do we have? Feed them up. We've got a lot of ancient literature. We've got the hints in the Gemara. We've got hints in the Heicholos literature. We've got the works of Hasidic Ashkenaz. We also have other ancient works floating around that date back to certainly can date back to roughly the era of Midrashim and Gemara, and according to Kabbalistic tradition, date back much earlier. Also, we have the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, ascribed perhaps to Avraham Avinu or to Rabbi Kiva. Again, that's the Kabbalistic tradition, but we know it's around. There's a sefer called Shiur Koma. Shiur Koma means the measure of the Koma, of the stature, and it describes the stature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the bodily proportions almost of Hashem. Now, of course, God doesn't have body, but we know that we use as a way of, if you're a mystic and you're trying to relate to Hashem, you use anthropomorphic language. The Torah does, the Yod Chazaka, the Zohar and Tuyah, and it sort of specifies, almost delineates the bodliness of Hashem using this metaphoric language. The Rambam meets the Shiur Koma, by the way. The Rambam comes across it and hates it and attacks it. The Gaonim, who are not Kabbalists, many of them, but are philosophers, see the Sefer Yetzirah. They're aware of this mystical work, the Sefer Yetzirah, and they translate it. They learn as a philosophical rather than a mystical text. But there are various Kabbalistic texts floating around. In fact, there are hundreds of them. I've just named the most famous. So Kabbalistic ideas are floating around pre the revelation of the Zohar. So I've listed this all as one category, which is pre-Zoharic Kabbalah. Okay. Then, basically 2 generations, 1.5 generations before the Ramban, the Zohar suddenly makes a public appearance. Where has it been till now? Good question. But it makes a public appearance. Has it been handed down secretly through the generations? Is it somehow a new revelation? All interesting questions. But the Zohar makes a public appearance. And ever since then, that becomes the central work of Kabbalah. And we're now in, it begins trickling through the Jewish world, and by the year, I don't know, 1200, it's sort of being studied quite intensely. And by the way, there are pre-Zoharic works that are around also that are similar to the Zohar. There's the Medrash HaNe'elam, for example, the concealed Medrash that the Ramban has, Nachmanides has. There's some evidence put forward by academics that the Rambam saw the Medrash HaNe'elam, and perhaps was okay with it, didn't dislike it as much as some of the other Kabbalistic works. So there are similar to the Zohar type works floating around, but the Zohar comes on and it sort of becomes the classic work. The Zohar is ascribed to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. I don't really want to go into it in the context of this. It deserves a discussion in its own right. But the Zohar is ascribed to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Whether that means that every part of the Zohar is Reb Shimon Bar Yochai or parts of it, and there were other additions and so on, is Chasam Sofer speaks about, Rabbi Yaakov Emden speaks about, academics speak about. But and that's why I'm giving a sort of neutral. It makes its appearance in that era in time. exactly how it makes its appearance and where it came from and how it's transmitted through the generations there's a range of views on that, but certainly it's accepted very, very quickly as being authoritative and
they actually written by Moses to Leon. And it contains a certain amount of medieval information.
So
by Yochai can
yeah, so I'm avoiding this whole debate because and the reason the reason I'm avoiding it is not because I'm trying to duck it. It's simply because here we're looking at the history of Kabbalah, and therefore, in a sense, I want to go through how the Kabbalists are seeing the writings of these works. It is correct that there's some language in it which suggests a later date. The Ramban himself, there was another Kabbalist called Rabbi Yitzchak ben Akko, who sent messengers to try and find out exactly where this appeared from. And none of this really matters from our point of view, which is that the Mukabolim, and the reason also I'm hesitating is because I'm not interested in picking a fight with Ariza and the Vilna Gaon and Baal Shem Tov and the great and mighty of Jewish history, who see the core of the text as being a representation of Kabbalah through the generations, even if bits here, there, and there's bits which Cordovero and already point out are perhaps later additions. But the Zohar either way becomes the changes the Kabbalistic landscape, and that now becomes the text that's learned. And now, Moshe Cordevero appearing on the scene as a Kabbalist he's born 1522, but begins learning Kabbalah 1542. There's been 300 years of writings on the Zohar. And all of this has to be, it's a mess. The Zohar is written, by the way, the structure of the Zohar is on the Torah, largely. So it goes in the order of the Torah, and if it's not structured in a sense, in a systematic way, it's very hard work to learn, obviously, and it's not structured in a systematic way, in conceptual way. You've had 300 years of writing on the Zohar after that, and then you have significant pre-Zoharic works, and how do you put it all together? And the answer is, comes along this remarkable figure, Moshe Cordovero, and he produces this encyclopedia. It's not just an encyclopedia, but it's a system. It's a coherent, rational system in which you sort of understand how all the bits and pieces fit in, and how out of Kabbalah emerges a systematic, coherent structure in which Kabbalah is dealing with real life issues. It's explaining this sort of world we live in, and godliness on the one hand, and the invisibility of godliness on the other hand. And don't forget, the Jewish world is traumatized by the expulsion from Spain. These are all first-generation Holocaust survivors, second-generation Holocaust survivors, right? That's what the remark is. He's 25 years after the expulsion from Portugal, or 30 years afterwards. He's either the child or the grandchild of traumatized refugees. The whole Sephardi world, in particular, is reeling. And the Ashkenazi world is not in such a good state either, and people are thirsty for making sense of everything. And there's been the big revelation of the Zohar, and therefore Kabbalah is much more out there. And to a large degree, people throw away the philosophical systems that have come earlier, of the Rambam and others. It doesn't speak to people, and the Ramak takes this whole massive genre and knocks it into shape. So he's a synthesizer and a systemizer of a remarkable, incredible ability. And those who are interested in Kabbalah go crazy over this work. They're blown away by it. Okay, so that's his main claim to fame. Either this week or next week, I'll talk about his other works, but I just want to finish the story just so that we've sort of got a picture of the landscape. What sort of things does the Ramak talk about in this work? What structure does he build? A structure that's actually remarkably familiar to us, because in many ways, it's not so different to the Lurianic structure that follows. He's the first to really sort of talk about in a significant way about symptom, contraction. So this Kabbalistic analogy of God needing to create space for us to exist, right? The big question philosophically on monotheism that's committed to an infinite, non-defined God is, if that's the case, how is there space for us? Where can we exist in a world of infinite? How can the infinite gods connect to the finite? How can there be a relationship between a physical, limited, delineated, changing universe and an unchanging, above physicality, beyond finite boundaries, God? How can the two coexist? And we spoke about this a little bit from the Rambam, Maimonidean perspective, but this is the big question. And the Ramak is the first to sort of systematically build a structure in which there's two key features for our purposes. I'm not a Kabbalist, but I'm just saying a little understanding of it. Symptom, which is this idea of somehow creating a space, a vacuum, a contraction. But what does that mean, and how does it not say there's an area devoid of godliness, God forbid? So it's at the same time suffused with godliness, but also space for the finite. And also this idea, which is around long before the Ramak. It's Neoplatonism already talks about it, and there's Jewish tradition around it. But it's also a system of the chains in which the infinite God can't directly relate to the finite universe, but there's a sort of flow of divine energy through the spheres, through these Chesed, Devorah, Tsefat, and so on, through this sort of flow of spheres, or not spheres, spheres is channels of spirituality. So this is the structure that the Ramak gives to the Kabbalistic world. Okay. Meanwhile, in Egypt, far but not super far from Tsefat, there is a figure called Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. As his surname would suggest, he's an Ashkenazi originally. He's part of the very, very big Luria family. But at some point, his family moves to Egypt, and he's raised by his uncle, who is a wealthy Talmud Chacham. His uncle is called Rabbi Tzalel Ashkenazi. Again, remember the rule about surnames. So his uncle is a Sfardi, but called Ashkenazi by surname because he's, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that more correctly. His uncle is living in the Sfardi, even Sfardi is a misnomer, in Egypt. He's in what nowadays we would call the Sfardi world, but he's of Ashkenazi connection somehow. And Rabbi Tzalel Ashkenazi, by the way, is the author of another, this is the era of collator, by the way. There's been 500 years of Jewish creativity, and now it needs to be sorted out. The Beis Yosef is a collator in halacha, right? That's what the Beis Yosef in the Shulchan Aruch is. The Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, is a collator in Kabbalah. Rabbi Tzalel Ashkenazi is a collator of Talmudic commentaries, and he produces the famous Shitta Mukabetzes. Shitta Mukabetzet. Shitta Mukabetzes means the gathered opinions. He takes all the commentaries written on the Talmud, and he sort of structures them and collates them, and he researches manuscripts, and he writes the Shitta Mukabetzes, used to this day very significantly in the world of yeshivas. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, his nephew, by the way, is the co-author of some of the volumes. So again, another Kabbalist who's a senior Talmudist. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria sees the Pardas Ramonim and is blown away. And he himself has been taking proto steps to systemize Kabbalah, and he sees this incredible figure who's laid the groundwork. And he says, that's it, I'm moving to Tsefat. And he moves to Tsefat, and here the historical record breaks down, but he certainly only has a very short amount of time to learn under the Ramak, under Moshe Cordevero. How much time does he have? According to some sources, 0. He arrives on the day of the Levaya of Moshe Cordevero. According to some sources, 40 days. 40 days is a useful and significant number because it sort of aligns with Moshe spending 40 days on Har Sinai and everything else. So maybe it's sort of caught up in legends, and that's where that number comes from. But maybe a couple of months, not a long time. He refers to the Ramak for the rest of his life as his Rebbe, Mori Rabbi. He sees the Ramak as his teacher. Whether that means literally through teaching or whether it means through the works, we don't know. Even if it's for a short amount of time, 40 days or a couple of months, they could have covered a lot of grounds in that time. I mean, again, we've spoken about their ability to write fast and talk fast and, mystical experiences and so on. But either way, the Ramak is the foundation upon which the Ariza builds everything else. The Ariza then begins tweaking the Ramak system and produces its own system, but it's generally agreed, and the Ariza acknowledges that himself, he couldn't have done that work had he not had the Ramak preceding him. So the Ramak creates a system, and then the Ariza creates his own layer on top of that system. He disagrees here and there with the Ramak, enough that it's almost seen as a different system, but everyone acknowledges that it's been built on the back of the Ramak system. And this is the main reason why the Ramak falls out of fame very, very quickly, because the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria system speaks to people more, very soon becomes, it's viewed as the better system, and it's Lurianic Kabbalah that then slowly sweeps across the world and spreads, and that becomes sort of authoritative. But everyone acknowledges that the system was only possible because of the groundbreaking work of the Ramak in producing his encyclopedia, and in many respects, the Arizal system is built on that, and is in some ways, though not others, a tweak rather than a complete change. The sort of consensus afterwards is that even though there are points of disagreement, there's broad agreement between the two, and perhaps even complete agreement, and is looking at things from different angles, and it was a different vocabulary and different way of thinking about things. It's not in many ways not a massive machlokas, even though there is real aspects of disagreement there. The Ramak had various Talmidim, including Reb Chaim Vital, And Reb Chaim Vital, after the Ramak dies, moves his allegiance to the Arizal. And Arizal dies 2 years after arriving in Tsefat. So he's only in Tsefat for a short time. Reb Chaim Vital, his Talmud, therefore, his Talmud, by the way, is slightly older than him again. Reb Chaim Vital is a bit older than Arizal, but he's the Talmud of the Arizal. Only therefore has contact with his great Rebbe, the Arizal, for a couple of years. And it's through Reb Chaim Vital and various other students, but largely Reb Chaim Vital, that we have all the Torah of the Arizal. Arizal didn't write much himself. The writings, what we consider generally to be the writings of Arizal, means the mystical writings of Arizal as transmitted via Reb Chaim Vital. Okay, so just so people aren't confused about the chain of tradition, we've spoken about pre-Zohar Kabbalah, very ancient works. We've spoken about 300 years post-Zohar. Then we have R Shlomo Alkabetz, a Kabbalist, a very important Kabbalist, who has a student, Moshe Cordovero, who supersedes him, who puts everything into shape and produces a coherent system. We have the Arizal, who is viewed as superseding the Ramak and creates his own system, and the transmission from the Arizal is via Reb Chaim Vital, who had been a Talmud of Moshe Cordovero, and then becomes a Talmud of the Arizal. From Reb Chaim Vital, the manuscripts go wild, and they begin spreading across the region. They make their way to Ashkenaz via the Shloch HaKadosh, the great Shiloh, and they gradually conquer East Europe, and the Torah of the Arizal conquers all really, and that's sort of how what we call modern day Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, sort of takes over the world. So this is a summary of the great achievements of the Ramak. I don't want to pretend to talk too much about things I don't understand, but just to give a little flavor of things that the Arizal says that the Ramak doesn't. It's the Arizal who sees the same system as the Ramak built, but views it almost as a drama. In other words, the Ramak, if we ask ourselves, where is there place for evil in the world? The Ramak answers the question. And he says, as God contracts himself in order to allow existence to exist, our existence to exist, there's places left where there's shadows, where there's a godly withdrawal, and that allows the flourishing of evil. The Arizal changes that metaphor, to the famous Shviras HaKelim, to the shattering of vessels, which is the idea that the very process of divine outflowing overwhelms the receptacles that can receive it, and they shatter. Just to give that a sort of psychological way of understanding it, so that we can relate to it a little bit, I want to use a very far off analogy, but just to give you a feel of it. Imagine a child of an overbearing, dominant father, and the child has no space to be themselves because the father is just so brilliant and so amazing and so staggering and so on. The child it tries to receive from their great father because they want to receive the wisdom of their father, but in so doing, they by definition destroy themselves because the very vessel that's receiving it doesn't give the child any room for their own personality, their own creativity. And the vessel has to shatter, meaning the child either becomes a nothing or has to rebel a little bit in order to find space for themselves. Now, that's an analogy of an overbearing father, but it happens to all of us. Every child in some way has to go through such a process. It's built into the system. And if God wants to give us existence, there's a paradox at work in which the very giving of existence means there has to be space for us to be ourselves. And we can only be that if we get broken somewhat through the experience, or the world gets broken through the experience, and there's somewhat of a distancing from godliness, and then a choice to come back. Because the child, as they mature, can say, I'm going to actually come back to my father's teaching and realize what a remarkable figure they were. But I'm now doing so of my own choice, and therefore it isn't destroying me in so doing. So Arizal has given a sort of framework, or in a mystical level, of why evil is a sort of drama that occurs, and how we humans have free will, and how through using our free will appropriately, we can reconstruct, we can fix the world. And this is where the whole imagery of tikkun comes from, of repairing a broken world. And the Ariza, when he gives that, somehow it completes the system, and people relate to it more. And Kabbalists engage in tikkunim now, in repairing. They were always even pre-Arizal tikkunim, but this sort of becomes systemized through the Arizal's approach. And it helps people also on a psychological level understand what they've gone through in the expulsion from Spain and everything else. Perhaps the rise of Kabbalah in East Europe takes place after the Chmielnicki massacres, when they go through these traumatic experiences. So Arizal gives sort of people a system that speaks to them, in which it no longer is doing a mitzvah just an obedience to commandment, no longer is doing a mitzvah just a l'shem yichud and a unification, but doing a mitzvah is a tikkun. It's repairing the world. It's partnering with Hashem in fixing this broken world. And that's sort of the change that takes place in the Jewish consciousness, in the Jewish mindset, and all of this is sort of part of the sort of revelation that the Ramak started, but that the Ariza completed. We're going to stop here, and next week, please God, we're going to look at other works of the Ramak, the Devorah, the Sefer Gerushin, so-called Book of Divorce, and other amazing works that or expulsion, other better translation, other amazing works that the Ramak wrote. And I hope also to try and share with you the Mussar thoughts of so buyer beware, the Mussar thoughts of the Ramak, and how one of his works, paradoxically, remains very, very famous in the yeshiva world to this day, the Devorah, and why that was the case. So we'll stop here for today, and I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. Good, thank you very much. Thank you.